Hi, my name is Eileen,
And I'm Ava.
and welcome to Harping Around. In this episode, we're going to be talking about one of the biggest topics in the harp world: pedal harps versus lever harps.
So we're going to take a look at what makes each kind of harp unique and what one can do while the other can't do. And while many harpists have a favorite between the two, there are many different things that give each their specific characteristics, which everyone likes.
While there are some things that are easier to do on one over the other, there are lots of things that can easily be done on both kinds of harp. Now, let's go ahead and start with the lever harp. So, one question that a lot of new harpists have, and a lot of people who see a harp, and it's the first time they've ever seen a harp, like, oh wow, this is so cool. What are those things up there for? Well, the name isn't anything fancy. They're just levers, and it's always so fun to show people who are just seeing the harp for the first time what the levers are. So if you take an F and raises it up 1/2 step from an F to an F sharp, and then bringing it to a different key and accessing different accidentals that way. And the typical range of notes for a lever harp varies drastically. I have seen lever harps as small as 10 strings. I have seen lever harps as many as 40 strings, and if there are more or less one direction or the other, I would love to see it. Let us know in the comments if you're aware of one, please. But this particular harp here has 26 strings. And there are lots of things that you can do with 26 strings, though some people prefer a larger lever harp, just so that way they've got more strings, especially the low notes. There are some pretty cool things that the lever harp can do thanks to being able to change the pitch of each string individually. Say, for instance, I've got from here up on my harp now in the key of D, where from here down it's in the key of C. So if I had a piece that was maybe a little more modern or something that was down low in the key of C, and then as it got higher it suddenly switched to D, I could just set my levers and didn't have to worry about it unless there was an accidental. So if I were to just do one great big 26 note scale up the harp like this, not something that just any instrument can do. Now, it can be hard to keep up with accidentals because sometimes you have an accidental that's the same each time you come across that note. Say, the D above middle C is always sharp in one particular piece. Set that D sharp, you don't have to change it. But if you're up and down all over, that could get pretty tiring and just about impossible at some tempos. Some people are up for the challenge, but not everybody wants to go through that much trouble for every piece that has a bunch of accidentals and other more chromatic spots like that. Range, like I mentioned before, is very much personal preference, but a smaller range can be limiting sometimes. This particular harp only goes down to the C below middle C. And for the vast majority of songs that are more folk melodies, popular tunes, than other styles that are more improvisational or therapeutic, that's not a problem that the rest of the bass clef isn't there. But if you're getting into more classical and other more known pieces specifically written for the harp, there's a lot of transposing by the octave, and not everybody is quite up for that challenge. And another challenge that comes along with the lever harp is which key to tune in. There's a lot of people in both camps as to which of the two primary keys to tune the lever harp in. The key of C, like this particular lever harp is tuned to, or the key of E flat, which is the key my other lever harp is tuned to. I like both and can't really argue one over the other. So it's all a matter of what you like to play and what works best for you.
Hey, thank you, Eileen. I actually started on the lever harp, and mine was actually an E flat. But then, yeah, and I started getting more into classical harp since my goal was to play in a youth orchestra. So I switched over to pedal harp, and here's my pedal harp. And I think for classical music, and for playing in an orchestra, a pedal harp is kind of necessary for all those different key chains and key changes. And so the main difference obviously is now we have pedals instead of levers. So up here instead of levers is mechanism. And so for the pedals, there's 3 different notches and 7 pedals, one for each of the strings. And each of the notches controls a different little pin here, which changes the pitch of the string. So the top notch is going to be flat. So here's C flat. And then I move it down one, C natural, and then C sharp. So as you can tell, it's a lot easier or more convenient to be able to do a lot of accidentals since obviously you aren't having to fiddle with the levers as you play, which is sort of the main difference. You can easily just do some key changes with your pedals. But it obviously for all harpists, lever or pedal, it is definitely hard to do a lot of like chromatic things. I'm sure you know. Yeah. And so the typical range of a pedal harp is a lot. I mean, there's less differences than I know with lever harp. So for pedal harp, this is a concert grand, so there's 47 strings, but I know there are petite or student level ones that have 40 strings. So the variance isn't as great as or the variance is as like, there's not as much variance as with lever harp. And then, I mean, obviously this instrument is very big. Mine is actually 6 feet tall and 80 pounds. So I think it's a lot harder to transport than with a lever harp. And then also for maintenance, I think there's also a lot more you have to do with like regulations. I know harpists normally have to regulate their harp every 2 or so years, where because there's just so much mechanism and it gets a bit complicated. So you do need someone to like, do touch-ups, which is like, yeah, I think, do you have any like things with maintenance for lever harp?
Lever harps are pretty easy in the maintenance department in
Yeah.
comparison, but they still have some little quirks to keep an eye on too. This particular kind of lever has plastic for the lever itself, but underneath, to keep the lever from going too far up, there's a little metal pin that's attached to the old bracket that the plastic part of the lever is on. And I'm still not entirely sure how people do this, but those metal pins can get bent by the plastic
Oh.
lever from too
Mm-hmm.
many enthusiastic lever flips over time. And this particular harp, I can see where I have gotten a little more enthusiastic on some levers than the others over the years. But sometimes those levers, when they get too much wear, do have to be replaced. And that is the case for any type of lever. And just how the discs can get out of alignment and not quite be right on that half step when engaged. Levers can have the same thing. So they sometimes need to be readjusted every now and then too. So no matter which kind of harp you go with, there's going to be some maintenance.
Of course, yeah.
Even though there's maintenance with both, there are some things that are very unique to each type of harp. One of the biggest differences that I personally have run into over the years is the difference in the strings. Not necessarily the materials that make as big of a difference, but the spacing and the tension. When I first started learning the harp, I would be practicing on this harp at home, which has lever, tension, and spacing. So the tension is much lighter. It's much easier for me to pull 2 strings together than it is on my pedal harp. And the strings are also noticeably closer together. And on fast passages in some pieces, that can be a big adjustment. And when I would go and play my teacher's harp that I had at the time when I first started lessons, it would be such a big adjustment even as a beginner, going between the lighter tension and the smaller spacing to the larger spacing and higher tension. So there are some lever harps that are made with pedal tension and spacing. While the spacing is the same, I have to say the tension is still a little bit lighter. It is very close, but not quite the same as a pedal harp. And like Ava mentioned before, there is a huge weight difference that can come between lever harps and pedal harps. Lever harps can get pretty light, some only about 7 or 8 pounds. Those are obviously smaller, but most don't exceed 30 pounds, whereas pedal harps easily 80 pounds and sometimes even higher depending on the model. And back with the strings, they can make a difference for a more experienced harpist in how it feels and also how it sounds and how it plays. This harp is strung and completely nylon, while most pedal harps are strung with a mixture of wire in the base, gut in the middle, and nylon up at the top. And exactly where the nylon ends and the gut begins depends on the harpist and personal preference. But there is a distinct difference in how the gut sounds in the middle ranges versus nylon. So that can play a big factor into what kind of lever harp one might prefer, whether they get one with gut strings or with nylon. And the overall tone, regardless of string type, can be very different. Smaller instrument, generally brighter sound. Larger instrument, generally a richer tone. But even between the smallest of lever harps and full-size concert grand pedal harps, there are still differences. Some can be described as a dark, others as sweeter and more bell-like, and everything in between. And each of all these kinds of harps all have their strengths for different settings. Small lever harps like this are great for traveling and taking places, bringing outside on a nice day that's not too humid or too dry. And also for therapeutic music settings. These are very popular with therapeutic musicians because they're easy to transport from room to room. Now, a little harp like that is going to have a really hard time being heard over a big orchestra, which is where the concert grands really shine, is in concert halls and other larger settings where you need a larger sound to fill the room.
As Eileen mentioned, there are a ton of differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. So both lever and pedal harp, you can play different techniques such as harmonics, glisses. You can do that on both type of harp, and also PDLT and a ton of different other techniques. And also things such as xylophonic, fingernail, paper strips in the strings, techniques such as those can be applied to both harps. And as I mentioned before, it's also tricky to play lots of very chromatic pieces on both. And, you know, although there are differences in pedal or lever, you do have to tune just as much for both harp. And at the end of the day, people are wowed by both of these instruments, and both pedal and lever harps are great instruments and really shine in their own ways. So you, the audience, what kind of harp do you usually play?
Or do you regularly play both kinds? Let us know down in the comments so we know how many like one, like the other, or like both.
Also, we're interested in knowing what you like to wear in different performance settings. We're looking for these answers for a future episode and would greatly appreciate your feedback.
And thank you in advance for your answers, and thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions, ideas for future episodes, or if you would like to come on and join us to talk sometime, feel free to leave a comment below or email us at harpingaround@harpsociety.org.
See you next time.